Officially, the events which reached a climax this past week, officially they began on October 7th with the Hamas attack on southern Israel. And in the course of the past 15 months, I would say there are two aspects to the unfolding events which have given rise to controversy. Or I should say two aspects, one of which I consider uncontroversial, and the other of which I consider that reasonable people can disagree. Let's start with the uncontroversial aspect. I would say it's uncontroversial that Israel, in the course of the past 15 months, has committed horrendous crimes in Gaza, in many respects unprecedented for the 20th century, and in some respects unprecedented going as far back as World War II. I don't think any serious individual can contest the fact that horrendous crimes have occurred. How do I reach that conclusion? On what basis do I reach that conclusion? I would put forth the following argument. In past conflicts in the Israel-Palestine situation, in past armed confrontations, the documentation relied on was usually human rights reports. There were the Amnesty International reports, there were the Human Rights Watch reports, and then there were the reports of local human rights organizations, such as B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and the various Palestinian human rights organizations, Al-Haq, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and so forth. Now, it was claimed, in my opinion, wholly without justification, but we'll set that aside. It was claimed that these organizations had a quote unquote pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel bias. That was the claim. As I said, I believe that claim has no foundation whatsoever, but that was the claim. The past 15 months has been unusual because for the first time, the human rights organizations, even though they have been active and have produced a significant amount of documentation, the human rights organizations were not the main source of information. On the contrary, the main source of information were the various international humanitarian organizations, which, because Gaza has been economically devastated since 2006, these organizations, these humanitarian organizations, have all set up shop in Gaza. And so when we judge the quality and the accuracy and the integrity of the various organizations supplying data on the situation in Gaza, we've almost entirely, as I said, the human rights organizations have produced significant documentation, but they have not been the main source. The main source has been places like Save the Children, World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders, UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And then there are the various human rights and humanitarian organizations, which are integral to or adjuncts to the United Nations. And so, in my opinion, when you look at the sources of the documentation, if I can give one simple example, if you look at the South African application to the International Court of Justice in January 2024, to be precise, I think it was December 29th, 2023, but we'll call it January 2024. That application, it contained literally over 300 footnotes. It was attempting to document, for those of you who might not be familiar with the proceedings, the South African delegation, a South African delegation, went before the International Court of Justice in January 2024. It presented what it called an application, which ran to 84 single-spaced pages, and as I said, well over 300 footnotes, and each of the footnotes itself contained multiple references to various reports and updates on the situation in Gaza. Now, what was very striking in that South African application was that, except for an occasional reference, and I mean occasional, reference to Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, apart from an occasional reference, the entire documentation adduced by South Africa in its attempt to demonstrate that Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza, virtually all its documentation in order to prove that claim that Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza, virtually all the documentation came from various humanitarian organizations or adjuncts or offices integral to the United Nations, starting with the UN Secretary General Guterres on down to the various organizations, as I said, which had already set up operations which were ongoing in Gaza. Now, I will make one more point on that, which is if you look at the documentation, there is very little disagreement among these humanitarian organizations, UNESCO, UNICEF, Save the Children, World Health Organization, and on and on. There's very little disagreement about what's going on there. There is, I dare say, and I will say, there is no controversy. So, on the factual question, on questions which typically come up, is Israel indiscriminately bombing and indiscriminately firing artillery in Gaza? Is Israel targeting journalists? Is Israel targeting medics? Is Israel targeting UN workers? Is Israel targeting children? Is Israel targeting hospitals? Is Israel targeting the most basic infrastructure in Gaza? Their infrastructure that provides water, electricity, and so forth. Is Israel targeting it? On those questions, which a lot of our mainstream media would have you believe there is controversy, the controversy reduces to this: what Israel alleges versus what virtually, and I'm not even comfortable using the qualifier virtually, I think even that understates the consensus. So I'll say what Israel alleges versus what the entire gamut of respected human rights organizations, including, by the way, many headed by Americans and many headed by people who are of Jewish descent, what all these organizations claim. Now, to my thinking, that is not controversy, because under the normal canons of law, there's a principle called evidence with and versus evidence without interest. That's a very simple concept. It means if you provide evidence that buttresses your cause or your, so to speak, side, if you provide evidence which buttresses your side, it's taken with a grain of salt or more because it's evidence with interest versus evidence without interest, namely evidence which doesn't buttress either side, assuming there are two sides, doesn't buttress either side in a particular instance. So Israel's quote unquote evidence is evidence with interest, whereas there's no discernible interest by these humanitarian organizations, let alone a collective interest such that you find unanimity across the board. there is little, if any, and I honestly can't think of any dissent on the fundamental questions. I just referred you to several of them: the targeting of medics, journalists, UN workers, the targeting of children, the targeting of hospitals, or to take another example, the use of starvation as a method of war. There is simply no dissent whatsoever. There is no dissent whatsoever that Israel's using starvation as a method of war, aside again from the dissent articulated by Israel, which doesn't count or not much weight is normally given to attestations or evidence with interest. So, on the factual questions, I would say there is no real controversy about what's been unfolding in Gaza. There are some technical points. For those of you who follow developments closely, there was a technical point about whether or not what the people in Gaza and later the people in the northern part of Gaza, were they experiencing food insecurity, hunger, starvation, or famine. And those are very technical terms, difficult for a layperson, at any rate, someone like myself, difficult to grasp the technical points which distinguish each of these delineations: food insecurity versus extreme food insecurity versus hunger versus starvation versus famine. And there was some controversy, but if you're not a technician, it didn't really amount to much. There was clearly serious hunger in Gaza, serious malnutrition in Gaza, and numbers of people perished from the lack of food. So there you could say there was some element of controversy, but really on such fine technical points that they are not, in my opinion, of any general interest. It's not as if a normal layperson would say, oh, it's just starvation, it's not famine. Those sorts of distinctions they're actually quite, in the context of what's happening, they're actually quite lunatic. But as a technical point, I suppose they have some significance. On the other hand, so just to clarify my own view, I would say on the factual questions, there's very little controversy, and where there is controversy, it's on very technical points of no great interest to a broad public or to a person who has a conscience. But then there's a second group of questions where I do believe there is legitimate difference of opinion. And I will name 3 examples of what I think are legitimate areas of disagreement. Point number 1, should Hamas have been condemned without qualification for what happened on October 7th? Is it a prerequisite, so to speak, for joining the conversation? Is it a necessary prerequisite for joining the conversation that each would-be participant, that he or she condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And as you can imagine, and as you all know, because no doubt you've had conversations on that topic with your family, friends, and professional colleagues, and if you're part of the leftist tradition, with your comrades. The second point of disagreement, where, in my opinion, reasonable people can disagree, is whether or not Israel had what is called a right to self-defense. Or, as it's sometimes put, what did you expect Israel to do? And that entails two aspects of that question. Number one, whether or not Israel was exercising a right to self-defense, or whether in the guise of exercising a right to self-defense, Israel was actually carrying out a genocide. The genocide was, it's argued, the genocide was disguised as self-defense. But that doesn't exhaust the question, because you can still argue that even if Israel was exploiting its right to self-defense in order to carry out a genocide, still it did have a right to self-defense. So that's the second question where reasonable people, I believe, can disagree. And then there is a third question, which can appear to be technical, but in my opinion is actually quite important. And that question is, assuming Israel is not carrying out a war of self-defense, what exactly is it doing in Gaza? Which is the question, is it a genocide? And right there too, in my opinion, there are two aspects to it. The first aspect is a technical one. Does it qualify as a genocide, either as defined by the International Court of Justice, as it's defined, genocide that is, as defined by the International Court of Justice, or as defined by Oxford English Dictionary, OED? Is it a genocide? And then there's a second aspect, which is really, what difference does it make? If it were mass murder, were it a crime against humanity, were it constituting the crime against humanity that's denoted the crime of extermination, or carrying out a genocide? Is it just a technical difference that's at stake? Or is there something more important that's at stake? I am of the opinion that it's not just a technical question. It's something more important that's at stake in denoting what has unfolded in Gaza as a genocide. So those are, in my opinion, the four areas where legitimate disagreement can be uh, can be entertained. Those are fair questions. I don't believe the factual questions are open for serious discussion. Now, I've spoken for about a half hour. I want to, what I can do, I'll take 15 minutes more to give you my own opinion on the four areas of agreement, four areas where of disagreement uh, in what's unfolded in the past uh, 15 months. On the first question, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And should that be seen, the condemnation, should it be uh, construed as a sine qua non, a necessary condition for being part of the conversation? Now, I am not of the opinion that what happened on October 7th was mostly perpetrated or even significantly perpetrated by Israel. The overwhelming number of deaths, the estimate is somewhere along the lines of 1,100. I think that's the last count, or 1,150, something like that. 800, more than 800 civilians, and about more than 300 combatants were killed on the Israeli side. I think they were overwhelmingly committed by Hamas, and I don't think there's, in my opinion, having read all the available information, at any rate in the English language, and it's quite voluminous, I don't think there's any serious grounds for dispute that overwhelmingly responsibility for those deaths has to be borne by Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza. So, having said that, in my opinion, which I've expressed on many occasions in the past 15 months, the closest analog to what happened on October 7th is the slave revolts in our own country and also elsewhere, for example, in Haiti. And as most of you know, the slave revolts are very bloody affairs in which large numbers of whites, civilians, were killed. In our own country, the biggest slave revolt was the one led by Nat Turner. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's not so far from where most of you reside in Boston. It occurred in Southampton. And it was pretty brutal. The rebels, led by Nat Turner, they disemboweled men. They smashed the skulls of women. They beheaded babies. It was a gruesome affair. Nonetheless, I will add the following, not so much caveats, I will add, I will fill out the full picture. The first point I would make is the abolitionists of the time, the white abolitionists, did not condemn Nat Turner. They were not at all reluctant to describe what happened during the Nat Turner revolt as horrifying and ghastly. However, they put the burden of what happened, the burden they laid at the doorstep of white folks. As William Lloyd Garrison wrote at the time, he said, "We told you so. We warned you and warned you and warned you. If you treat people, human beings, this way, you cannot be shocked or pretend to be shocked when a revolt of the magnitude of Nat Turner's revolt happens." I found personally the most useful or illuminating statement. It came from an organization called the New York Working Men's Party. The New York Working Men's Party. And like everybody else, they described what happened during the Nat Turner revolt as, quote, an unjustifiable atrocity. You cannot justify an atrocity of the kind that occurred during the Nat Turner revolt. But then they went on to say, and let me quote them, of what were the South African Negroes guilty? Of putting to death men, women, and children. For what purpose? Plunder? No. There is no evidence that such was their object. On the contrary, almost all the accounts of the Nat Turner revolt concur in stating that they expected to emancipate themselves, and they no doubt thought that their only hope of doing so, of freeing themselves, was to put to death indiscriminately the whole race of those who held them in bondage. In their minds, the only way they could free themselves from slavery was by putting to death indiscriminately the whole race of those who held them in bondage. If such were their impressions, if that's what they believed, were they not justifiable in doing so? If they believed the only way to free themselves was to put to death the whole race that held them in bondage, were they not justifiable in doing so if they believed that? And the New York Working Men's Party says, undoubtedly they were. If freedom is the birthright of men, as the Declaration of Independence tells us. So, not in any way trying to deny the magnitude of the atrocity that occurred, be it in Nat Turner or be it on October 7th, the Working Men's Party says, were they not justifiable in believing that there was no way to free themselves from this concentration camp, as Israel's head of the National Security Council described it? He described Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp, to which I would add, half of whom's inmates were children. Most, probably all actually, all of those who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th had been born into that concentration camp. And so, was it not justifiable, their belief that the only way they can gain their emancipation, their, so to speak, God-given right to be free, was to indiscriminately kill the whole race that held them in bondage? That's point number one. Point number two, if you read the literature on Nat Turner, which I have, not extensive, but also not sparse, there is a scholarly literature. Black people overwhelmingly supported Nat Turner, or as they called him, Old Nat. And they called what happened during the revolt Old Nat's War. So even as white society was aghast at what happened during the Nat Turner revolt, the evidence seems to be conclusive that Black people supported him, just as the evidence seems overwhelming that the people of Gaza supported October 7th. Furthermore, the pillars of the African American freedom struggle, be it Frederick Douglass, who called Nat Turner one of our founding fathers, or be it W.E.B. Du Bois, or I should say, Douglass also called Turner one of our, quote, glorious martyrs. And Du Bois, who was mentioned in the introduction as having spoken at the church, he too recognized Nat Turner as being one, so to speak, data point on the trajectory in the freedom struggle, which climaxed in the Civil War. And thirdly, right now, not just in African American history, but in American history, Nat Turner occupies a revered place. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear, what happened during the revolt is beyond extenuation. They beheaded babies and threw them in the fireplace. It was ghastly. But he still honored Why is he honored? Um, in my opinion, because his driving impulses traced back to an indomitable will and an irrepressible humanity. He was a very impressive guy. For those who've read about him, black people, white people, everyone agreed. Nat was a smart guy. He was a very smart guy. And what drove him to undertake this revolt, one historian, as one historian put it, let's see if I can find it because I like the quote. Let's see. Let's see. Well, the quote, I should have already memorized it by now. It was that at core, what drove Nat Turner was this huge chasm between what he aspired to be and what he was destined to be, namely a person of very impressive intellect who probably could have achieved great things in life, but a huge chasm separated his aspirations and what he was, a slave. A slave he was born, a slave he lived, and a slave he would die. And in my view, that was the primary motivation of the young men who burst the gates of Gaza. They were born into a concentration camp. They languished in that concentration camp. And as of October 6th, they were destined to die in that concentration camp. So when you're asked the question, do you condemn what happened on October 7th? In my opinion, the proper reply would be, do you condemn Nat Turner's revolt? Do you condemn Nat Turner's revolt? As to the second question, I'm going to leave it at the second question because I could see time is passing. Namely, what was Israel to do? Or did Israel have a right to self-defense? Now, as I said, that entails two aspects. Number one, was Israel carrying out a war of self-defense? In my opinion, and we can get to that in questions and answers, in my opinion, the self-defense aspect was trivial next to the aspect of trying to once and for all solve the Gaza question by committing a genocide in Gaza. However, let's look at the question, was it, even if it were a war of self-defense, did they have that right? So I will put this question to you and you decide for yourself. So, there's a woman married to a fellow who brutalizes her, who beats her, who torments her day in and day out for 2 decades. The blockade of Gaza began in 2006. We're now at 2025. For 2 decades, the woman is beaten, tormented, brutalized, tortured. She lets out screams and yells of agony at her situation, hoping to arouse the conscience and then the intervention of her neighbors. Some people are sympathetic, but nobody does anything. And then finally, she summons the courage to call the police. The police come, they conduct an investigation, they produce a voluminous report, just like those scores of human rights reports that have been produced over the past 20 years describing that crime against humanity, Israel's blockade of Gaza, describing Israel's multiple war crimes and crimes against humanity that it committed in the course of its periodic high-tech killing sprees in Gaza. Operation Protective Edge, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and on and on. All these reports condemning what Israel has done in Gaza, all the condemnations of the illegal blockade that Israel has imposed on Gaza, all the reports, voluminous, meticulous, authoritative, and what happened to them? They were all just placed in drawers to collect dust. So, she called the police, they did nothing. And then, one day, call it October 7th, her spouse is approaching her, another torture, another brutalization, another agony. Well, this time she reaches for the kitchen knife and she stabs him. And she stabs him again. And she stabs him a third time. He then reaches for his pistol and he kills her. Now, as you most of you know, in a court of law, he probably would win on the grounds of self-defense. He had a right to self-defense. But as a moral principle, you know, Martin Luther King liked to quote St. Augustine, an unjust law is no law at all. An unjust law is no law at all. You'll see him quoting Augustine in the letter from a Birmingham jail. In any event, did he have a right to self-defense? Did he have a right to kill her or after 2 decades of brutalizing, tormenting, torturing that woman, he had forfeited his right to self-defense. Okay, I will leave it at that, and then we can proceed with participation from you.
Thank you very much, Professor Finkelstein.